My name is JT Van Zant, and I'm a fly fishing guide on the Gulf Coast of Texas. Being out on the water has always been the secret to unlocking my soul. A sense of calm comes over me and I feel like I can breathe. That feeling inspires deep thought and conversation with my clients. I truly enjoy sharing perspective on the human experience with folks I take fishing. My podcast, Drifting, brought to you by YETI, was created with the goal of capturing those candid conversations with people who inspire me and sharing their stories with an audience that has the same restless curiosity that I do. Thanks for listening to Drifting. Memories of childhood are often triggered by certain sights or smells or sounds. I remember time spent with my grandparents as a young boy in Hallettsville, Texas, and hearing the CBS News in the background and the voice of Dan Rather reporting the day's events as my grandmother fried pork chops and my grandfather sat in his rocking chair smoking Salems and sipping Seagram 7 and 7-Up. That same voice was present in my adulthood as I tuned into any major event that was happening in our country. Dan Rather has covered every major news story in modern American history: political elections, natural disasters, conflicts overseas, you name it, he was there. He's a man of high integrity, intelligence, great perspective. My fondness of Dan went through the roof when I had the opportunity to fish with him and his son Dan Jack. The fishing was slow, so I rode the boat all day and grilled Dan with questions about his career. He gave thoughtful answers and recalled hundreds of stories with pinpoint accuracy. When I decided to try my hand at this podcast thing, he was at the top of my list of potential guests. I asked him, and luckily he agreed to sit down with me. I came to tears when he described his time as a boy with his grandmother Paige in Bloomington, Texas. And I benefited greatly from his advice to me as a man of this country and as a father to my sons and a husband to my wife. It was a privilege, I'll never forget it. I'm happy to share this insightful discussion with an American broadcasting legend, Dan Rather. You know, Dan, not long ago I had the opportunity to fish with you, and I didn't quite believe it was real until you stepped on the boat. We had some pretty slow bass fishing that day, if I recall, a little overcast, conditions weren't great. Your son Dan Jack stuck with it and was powering casts against the bank all day and came up with a single nice bass that I took a photo of you guys with.
Well, that's true. Dan Jack's a whole lot better caster than I am, which is damning with faint praise, but he's a pretty good fisherman. We had a great day in the water.
Based on the lack of productivity from the fish, I actually got to spend a lot of time talking to you and gaining perspective from your life and your career. And it's one of the highlights of occupationally and just personally to spend time with you. I might have told you, I might not have, that growing up in the summertime with my grandparents in Hallettsville, Texas, not too far from Wharton, where you were raised, I would basically be making a ruckus, and my granddad would hush me when the nightly news came on. And I would pull a blanket over the floor vent where the AC would come up through the floor in the mobile homes and just sort of get comfortable, and I would be sort of just put to ease by the sound of your voice. And then as I grew older, I counted on that same voice for pertinent information in our society. And so I'm just really honored to have been able to spend time and get to know you a little bit. And thanks for that opportunity.
Well, listen, you're welcome, but the honor is mine, JG, to fish with a great caster and a great fisherman that you are. Wow, what an afternoon we had. Actually, we had all day on the river because we
sure
we
did.
had lunch on the river.
You told me about your trips to visit Fidel and how he loved Cutty Sark.
Yeah.
You told me about the struggle of deciding whether or not to follow the demand of Saddam Hussein asking you to kiss him on the cheek and knowing what that could do to your career back home.
Hold hands with him.
Excuse me. Ultimately, you chose not to and got sat in a bare room for a while, right?
True
Before
enough.
whisked off to the embassy.
Well, you know, we'll get to business in a minute, JG, but I have a connection with Hallettsville, a small connection. You know, I went to college at what was then Sam Houston State Teachers College, a very small teachers college at the time. It's a big state university now. But one of my suite mates in college for the first couple of years was Wee Willie Kabinka from Hallettsville, Texas.
Oh, really?
The Kabinka family was big in Hallettsville not being very big. He was, his lower extremities were made limp by polio, and he was the first person that I had ever seen with that condition who would drive a car, that he had all of the clutch and gear shifting was he could do with his hands. He had a specially equipped car. And I have very fond, he's now passed, but I have very fond memories of Kabinka, who taught me a lot in his own way without ever intending to, that he was so determined to be a success in life. A success for him was to be an air conditioning engineer, which he became. Air conditioning, we're talking about the 1950s, and air conditioning was fairly new, particularly window air conditioners, that sort of thing. And little Sam Houston had a very small department to train people to maintain and repair air conditioning. So Kabinka was an air conditioning major at Sam Houston. But what he taught me was, with just the way he lived his life, he had these physical challenges, but it never stopped him from doing anything. He dated girls, he played a little football, and you could say, well, how did he do that? It's a long story, but he just refused to let his vulnerabilities and what could have been his weaknesses be anything but strengths. And it was a very good lesson for me to learn when I was 18, 19 years old. So I owe wee Willie Kabinka from Hallettsville, Texas, quite a lot.
Do you think his parents didn't cut him any slack? Of course, there must have been love, or he wouldn't have been successful in that mindset.
That's very
right?
insightful. That his being a suite mate, we had rooms on either side of a bathroom, and everybody had a roommate, and you had suite mates. But two things: he was enveloped with love by his family, had a very tight, what used to be called nuclear family, and that was one thing. And the second thing was, particularly his father never cut him any slack, never allowed him to use his infirmity as an excuse for anything. And Willie could talk pretty eloquently. He was not normally an eloquent fellow, to say the least, but he could talk eloquently about how important that had been to him.
Was that similar to your childhood?
Well, in some ways it was. As I may have mentioned to you, I had rheumatic fever between the ages of roughly 11 and about 14. This was in the 1940s, and at that time, rheumatic fever was an incurable disease. It was every mother's nightmare, second only to polio. But I contracted rheumatic fever. It attacks your lower joints. It stiffens up all of your lower joints, starting with your toes, working up to your ankles and knees. And the danger is it will reach your heart. And most people who've had rheumatic fever during that period, I repeat for emphasis, is completely curable now. But during that period, the great danger was it would get to your heart. Most people suffered heart problems later in life because it had rheumatic fever. The doctor, young Dr. Lewis Cope in Houston, who's now passed, who diagnosed that I had rheumatic fever, told my mother, to her soon-to-be completely white-faced terror, that there was no known cure for it, and that the only thing he could prescribe is to put me to bed and have me move as little as possible. Just stay in bed, don't move, and if we're lucky and have God's grace, maybe it won't reach his heart. So in answer to your question about what I shared by distance with my friend Kabinka, was that I was bedridden for one time almost 9 months, and for another time just over a year, by the stay in bed, don't let you move thing. And I will say that looking back on it, I didn't realize it at the time, that it gave me a strong, at a very early age, sense of mortality. That saying to myself, if I ever get up from here, boy, am I going to live. I want to play football. I'm going to be a great reporter. I'm going to be all these things. That because at that age, we're talking about 11 to 14, normally you don't think about your mortality.
Certainly not. Yeah, a healthy boy, that's the last thing on his mind. I'm not sure that this is psychologically
can be supported by psychological science, but I do think it was a great motivator for me, because when I did finally get up and I finally recovered from rheumatic fever, and thank God to this day, I do not have any heart problem. Every doctor I go to, when they ask me, what have you had, and I check rheumatic fever, they right away say, well, what's the matter with your heart? And I'm proud to say to them, there's nothing wrong with my heart, because my mother made sure that I stayed in bed during that time. But when I got up, and my father made a really smart decision. I was emaciated, just absolutely so thin, I turned sideways, you couldn't see me. And I was very weak. And my father said in my presence to my mother, we have to get him to work. He has to do manual labor. That's the only thing that will save him. So I went to work in a brush cutting crew after that. And it took me a while, but I got my strength back. And that was a very important decision by my father.
Now, was he empathetic throughout this process of you being bedridden? He was a laborer by trade.
He was. He was a laborer and worked long hours, and it was his job to be on the job just before the sun came up, because digging ditches in the Texas sun can get to be tough. So you want to dig the best and the most and the hardest early in the morning and late in the evening. So he worked long hours and very hard. But to answer your question, he was very empathetic. He and my mother, both of them worked. My mother was a waitress. They were both empathetic, and just wonderful to me during that period. Just, I was completely enveloped in love, not pity. Mm-hmm. There's a difference. And enveloped in love, but not pity.
Very interesting point, because we're so safe with our children now, and we don't want them to experience any hardship, and we keep, it wasn't unusual when you were a boy in Texas to have a .410 shotgun before you were 10.
Well, I had one.
And now we argue with our wives of whether a BB gun at 13 is even appropriate.
Well, it's a different world now, to say the least. And, a discussion of guns and the fact that we are a gun culture, not just in Texas, but our whole country is a gun culture, that I grew up with guns. My father loved to hunt and fish. He liked fishing a little better than hunting, but only a little better. But there were great differences. For one thing, while I did have a BB gun first, at, I think age 5 or 6, fairly quickly went to a single-shot .22. That's the way you did it. You worked your way up to .310, and then eventually got a high-powered rifle. And I did grow up hunting and fishing. I shared my father's passion for it. But you were taught, first of all, gun safety. You were really taught about gun safety. You were also taught, and this has gone badly out of fashion, I'm sorry to say, the ways of the animal. For example, you start out hunting squirrel and rabbit, but before you ever hunt them, your father and my Uncle John and various friends would teach you the life cycle of the animal, the habits of the animal, the whole idea. And I recognize this will strike some people now as crazy or odd, but it was very common in those days, that you didn't hunt anything until you learned the ways of the animal. The idea was you were to feel one with the animal. Now, I know some people listening to this might say, well, then you go hunt and kill them. Well, yes, but it's hard to explain, but it was that if you were decent and ethical, you didn't hunt anything that you weren't going to eat, and you didn't hunt them until you could kind of feel the oneness with them. I recognize it here in the second decade of the 21st century, it may sound rather odd, but it was the way things were done at that time.
And it's beautiful. We've lost a little bit as we've lost part of that process along the way, haven't we?
Well, we've lost a great deal along the way. I was invited some years ago when I first came to New York to hunt. A friend of mine asked me to go deer hunting. And I hadn't deer hunted in some years, but I went with him mostly for the camaraderie of being with him. But when we got out, we got to a hillside in northeast New York. The hillside was completely covered with men with high-powered rifles. And I'm saying to myself, this is insane. And going through my mind was, it has to be that many of these people don't know anything about guns. They work on Wall Street or they work somewhere in the city, and they're just out for the first time, and what a dangerous situation this is. And I said to my friend, I can't go there. He said, well, why not? Come on, this is the way we hunt up here. And I said, well, it's not a hunting I recognize. I'm not going to get out of the pickup truck, because I had already been in some dangerous situations as a reporter. But I could be dumb as a fence post about a lot of things, but I was at least smart enough to know how dangerous that was.
Can you talk a little bit more about growing up in Wharton, Texas back then?
Well, I was born in Wharton. But JT, I didn't actually grow up in Wharton.
Moved to Houston shortly after, right?
Yes. My father basically dug ditches for pipelines, and they were building a pipeline from somewhere down around near Cuero, Texas, to Houston. And he met my mother in Victoria, Texas. You draw a line from roughly Cuero up to Houston and go through Victoria. He met my mother in Victoria, married her there. I think I probably was conceived in either El Campo or Edna, there on a line going toward Houston, and then was born in Wharton. So it was kind of an accident that I was born in Wharton, because as the pipeline progressed, they moved from Victoria to Edna to El Campo, then to Wharton. So I was in Wharton for the first year and a half of my life. I have no early memories of it because I was an infant and a toddler. And then we moved to the very edge of Houston, a place called the Houston Annex, Heights Annex, which at that time was literally, we lived on the next to last street in the city limits in Houston. And beyond that was a great forest and Buffalo Bayou. And I spent a lot of my youth, in fact, nearly all of my youth was spent there. And basically our playground was a big meadow, a big pasture, just beyond our house, and beyond that was the bayou and the woods.
Did you do some squirrel hunting in those woods?
I did do some squirrel hunting in the woods, but my father and I hunted squirrel, but we most of the time hunted squirrel in what is now known as timberland. These are suburbs of Houston. In Katy, we hunted squirrel, rabbits around Katy, and later hunted ducks. You know, I hated duck hunting. I love being outdoors. Love almost anything in the outdoors, but oh man, did I hate duck hunting. Get up early in the mornings and out there in the wet cold.
It's hard to make them tasty, too.
Yes. Well, and to tell you the truth, I wasn't much of a shot on the ducks. You can argue I wasn't much of a shot on anything, but I certainly wasn't very much on the ducks.
Can you talk a little bit more about when you say you observed the animal and became one with the animal you were going to be privileged to hunt? What was that process like?
Well, the process was like, first of all, my father and my Uncle John and their friends, who were all hunters, would talk about the squirrel. They would talk about the habits of the squirrel, the mating habits, gestation period, birth period, learn about something about the history of the squirrel with the Indians, what we now call Native Americans, and how important the squirrel were to them, particularly to the East Texas Indians. And so you got some of it word of mouth, if you will, then a book, maybe encyclopedia, read up on squirrel, and then you would take a kind of advanced course, if you will, in which without any weapons, you go out into the woods and you sit and you watch the squirrels for hours on end and kind of whisper a little bit, then come back home and talk about what you had seen, all by way of just making you feel as much as possible one with the animal.
And all that observation, I'm sure you pick up quite a bit on their habits and their interactions. They play a lot with each other. They torment each other.
They
chase each other around.
Well, and also the most productive place to hunt squirrel is where the hardwood meets the pine. The pine being very tall trees, and the hardwood producing nuts. So any place you can find where the hardwood meets the pine.
Well, I'll be on the lookout for that.
That's prime squirrel hunting.
That's a new one to me. Do you know why?
Well, as I say, I think it was because the combination of the pine trees gave them height against predators, man as well as other animals, and the greenery in pine cones, and the hardwood also gave them, because hardwood tends to be leafier, plenty of hiding places, and hardwood produces nuts, and nuts are, of course, the main nutritional value that squirrels have. So just take it from me. Where the hardwood meets the pine, there'll be squirrel.
I'll be looking. You knew at a pretty young age what you wanted to be, didn't you?
I did, JT. In that sense, I've been very lucky and mightily blessed. I've never quite known the reason, but all I've ever aspired to be in a professional way is a journalist. Although, note that in my time and place when I was being formed, which was Texas during the Depression years of the 1930s, nobody used the term journalist, except everybody used the term reporter. A journalist was a reporter with a cane, an older. But when we played those games when I was, as early as 5, 6, 7 years old, the games you play, what do you want to be when you grow up? Somebody say, I want to be an Indian chief. Somebody say, I want to be an airplane pilot. Astronauts were unknown at that time. I always said, I want to be a reporter. I've never known why that is, but my suspicion is as follows, that neither my mother nor my father had finished high school. It sounds a bit odd today, but in that time and place, Texas, 1930s, it was not unusual. Neither one had finished high school. But they were far from being dumb people.
Oh, absolutely.
And one reason is they were avid newspaper readers. And I grew up in a home, my earliest memories of my parents reading papers. My father had newspapers stacked in corners. My mother was always on to throw some of those darn newspapers away. But they read newspapers, they absorbed newspapers, they discussed what was in the newspapers. Other family members came over and they would have discussions. Remember, well, about the time I was becoming of memory age, what Winston Churchill called the gathering storm was underway in Europe. The forerunners of World War II, Hitler was coming to power. And they would have these discussions about what's in the paper. And here's the point. I think in my very young mind, 4, 5, 6 years old, because my parents spent so much time with the newspapers, I can remember my father saying time and again, the newspaper is the poor man's university. And they viewed it that way. So because they spent some time with newspapers, I think I came to believe, well, it must be important what's in newspapers, and that led to thinking, well, if you could work for a newspaper, that would be important.
Interesting. You picked up the intensity that they studied that source of information, and for you, it must have been all important.
Well, exactly. And seeing them do that, read the paper, discuss the paper, even next morning, there was always a morning paper at that time. Newspapers were big. Radio was beginning to come on. Television was unknown. And in Houston, you had 3 daily newspapers. Houston Post in the morning, Houston Chronicle in the afternoon, Houston Press sort of in between, slightly afternoon paper. But even before my father would go to work, and he went to work very early, they would just devour the Post. But among my fondest memories, my father would not only discuss newspapers, but he would critique newspapers. And we went through, it was sort of humorous at the time, and it's become even more humorous to me in memory, that my father would read an editorial in the Houston Post in which he disagreed with the editorial opinion. He would tell my mother, drop our subscription to the Houston Post. I'm not dealing with the Houston Post anymore. Then he would read the Houston Chronicle for a while, and they would have an editorial he didn't like. He would throw the newspaper against the wall and say, Burl, drop our subscription to the Houston Chronicle. Same thing that happened to the Houston Press. And for a short period of time, the only paper we had was the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which came by mail from St. Louis, and the Christian Science Monitor. This is when my mother talked him into, we should take the local newspapers again, Irvin. So we'd go through the routine again. But
until something ticked him off. Now, despite his reliance on that stream of information, when he found out that being a journalist was all important to you, he didn't agree with that career choice, did he?
No, it was less that he didn't agree with it. He didn't understand it. This has always been a bit of a puzzle to me, because when I began to say, as early as junior high school, I want to work at a newspaper. I want to work. My father would say, well, no, you want to be an engineer. Keep in mind that for him, in the ditch when an engineer would come for the pipeline company or something, it was like seeing a Marine or Army general, and he held engineers in great reverence.
Yeah, the man with the plan.
His dream for me was to become an engineer. If I could have become a petroleum engineer, that to him would have been the absolute ultimate goal. But keep in mind that he hadn't finished high school, never been on a college campus, and his view was, quite frankly, that I might leave school at age 16, as many people did in our neighborhood, many young men, go to work in the oil field, maybe get a job as a roustabout, eventually become a roughneck, which I did later on in the summers. But the point is that he couldn't grasp what going to college really meant. Mm-hmm. He wasn't opposed to my going to college, but he questioned, was this a damn fool idea or an empty dream? First of all, how are we going to get him to college? I'm not playing humble beginnings here, but money was very tight, and sometimes there wasn't any. So the idea of my going to college to my father was just an empty dream. For my mother, it was a driving dream. That my mother's view was, if we can just get Dan to college. I have a younger brother and younger sister. Her idea was, first of all, in the world that Dan is going to be moving into, college is going to be really important. But secondly, if I can just get him to college and get him through college, first of all, get him to college, then get him to stay to college, then there's a better chance that his brother and sister will also go to college. So my mother had a driving dream of my going to college. It wasn't that my father was opposed, but he just thought it was an impossible dream. I mean, how are we going to pay for it? How is he going to support himself? I mean, he just couldn't grasp it. And when I began talking about going to college, because when I started hanging around newspapers, running coffee and sort of hanging around, that most of the reporters at that time had not been to college. Some of them had not finished high school. But when I would ask them for advice or counsel, without exception, I would say, look, in your time, Dan, if you haven't been to college, you probably aren't going to be able to get a job in journalism. So that's when going to college became a goal of mine. And when I talked about going to college, my father basically dismissed it. And then when it became clear to him, as a combination of my mother's determination to get me there and my desire to be there, he said, well, if you're going to college, I mean, journalism, reporting, he couldn't quite grasp it, even though he was a great fan of newspapers and read in newspapers. He just had this sense, you won't be able to make a living at that. In his world, you made a living with your back in your hands, or a combination of your back in your hands and being trained as an engineer. Mm-hmm. So again, he wasn't opposed to my going to college, but he just thought it wasn't possible, certainly very improbable. But if I was going to go to college, then he couldn't envision spending 4 years doing something. When I got out of college, I might have trouble getting a job, might be able to make it. He just couldn't grasp the whole thing.
Yeah. So
I want to make clear here, I'm not being critical of him, because
absolutely
he came from, in many ways, a different cosmos.
Well, I think the most important thing for me that you said that warms me about him is that he was compassionate and empathetic to you and was loving as a father, albeit probably pretty stern and strict as was the time. But there was love, there was obvious love and compassion for you. He was just confused about the route you were taking to get there.
Exactly.
But not condemning of your choice.
No, but after I got out of college, and I spent a very short time in the Marine Corps, I have one of the shortest and least distinguished records.
Because of rheumatic fever, right? Came back to haunt you again.
Yes. Well, rheumatic fever was a so-called disqualifying disease. But by the time I was 18, I'd recovered from rheumatic fever, had played football, worked in the pipeline ditch, worked oil field deck floors, and knew I was physically fit. So I'm not proud of it, but I lied about it. When you go to apply to get in the Marines, they say, have you ever had, and they have a list of things that are automatically disqualifying. And when it came to rheumatic fever, I didn't check that I'd had it. After I got in and had trained for a while, They found out about it, asked me about it, and I leveled with them and said, well, yes, I did have it, but I'm over with it now, and just almost immediately I was out. But at any rate, after I graduated from college early, I graduated in the summer of 1953. I'd started midterm 1950. Immediately joined the Marines. The Korean War was on. It was beginning to wind down, but it was still on. Went to the Marines, and when I came back from the Marines, I had a hard time getting a job. There was a slight recession, nothing like 2008, but there was a bit of a recession. And I just couldn't get the time of day anywhere for a job in journalism. And I applied for any number of jobs. One was being a safety engineer at a steel mill on the outskirts of town, that sort of thing. And my father was very encouraging during that period because I can't say I was depressed, but it was a low time for me. Mm-hmm. That I loved the Marines. I loved everything about it. And I really fought very hard to stay, but it didn't work out. So, I was out of the Marines, didn't have a job, having trouble getting a job. But my father was somewhat encouraged because I began to apply for jobs such as the safety engineer, and there was a oil refinery assistant pipe fitter or something. So he thought, okay, that's a path he understood. But he recognized that I was just aflame with the passion to be in journalism. And he did give me, not a lecture, but he gave me an encouraging talk of, well, if that's your passion, if that's what you want to do, I don't understand it. And implicitly he was saying, I think it's a damn fool idea, but don't give up, be persistent. He was a great preacher of the gospel of persistence, and said, even if you take one of these other jobs, you ought to be persistent about it. It was very good. And much later, just shortly before he died, I had gone, I worked for the Associated Press and worked around a few local newspapers. But I was a very poor speller, which is a bad weakness to have. If we had spell check when I was coming up, I'd probably still be a newspaper man.
So there's hope for me, is what I'm hearing.
But at any rate, I had wandered from being a failed newspaper man into radio, and then had gotten a job at the local television station. This was in 1960. And at the television station, while I think my first salary there was either $9,500 a year or $10,000 a year. But after coverage of Hurricane Carla in 1961, in which our station went from a bad third to a first, I got a raise. And the raise was to $12,000 a year. My father at that time was making the most money he'd ever made. It was $12,500 a year. I was making $12,000. I wasn't making as much as he was, but I was getting in the neighborhood. When CBS offered me a job in the wake of covering Hurricane Carla, the television station, which didn't want me to move to CBS because we were doing well in the ratings, said, we'll raise you to $12,500 and maybe eventually $13,000 a year. My father was very proud of that. He said to me, I'm very proud of the fact my son is going to make more than I do. And when I got the job at CBS News, and the pay was $17,200, and I came back and told my parents I was going to take the job at CBS, partly because I was fairly recently married, had 2 young kids, and it paid $17,200. That my father, a rare thing for him, I only recall seeing him do it 1 or 2 times, or literally teared up just a little bit. This was not in his character at all. Teared up a little bit, and he looked at my mother and he said, I think Dan someday may make $25,000 a year, which to him was, astronomical.
Right at twice.
But unfortunately, only about 3.5 months after I went to work at CBS News, he died instantly in an automobile accident.
Oh. I'm really glad he got the opportunity to share that he was proud with you.
Well, so am I.
Absolutely. You know, if you look at your body of work, it's just staggering. UT right now has an exhibit, basically an archive, and they put together a website, danratherjournalist.org. You are considered one of the most important people in America, amongst the most impactful citizens in this country for the work you've done, decades and decades. What makes you Dan Rather? Where did that come from? How did you become so determined and get the work ethic that you have and make such an impact on the world of news?
Well, thank you very much, JT. And I'm not going to sit here. Thank you, JT. I'm not going to sit here and look down, run my hands around the brim of my hat, look at my boots, and say, "Oh, shucks." However, I'm not one of the most important people in my community, much less our country or in society. Just simply not true. That I have a lot of faults, and including the kind of arrogance and conceit that can only come of being a television anchorman sometime. Mm-hmm. But I have this part of my life, the professional life, finally in some perspective. That what you're looking at here across the table here and sharing cups of coffee is what I am at base. I'm a reporter who got lucky. Very, very lucky. Now, it is true that, I've worked hard. I've always prided myself on being a hard worker because my father was. That I got from my mother and father. And to your question of whatever I have become, keeping in mind that I'm basically a workaday reporter who got really lucky. The work ethic definitely came from my mother and father. They were very hardworking people. They shored that up. The example they set by words of saying, you got to work. And my father, at a reasonably early age, told me once, he said, the biggest compliment that you can pay a man is that he's a good hand in the oil field and in the ditches. A good hand meant being a really good worker. And that the most important thing in your life in terms of your work is that you get the reputation of being a good hand. And so the work ethic part came basically from my mother and father. It also came from that time having rheumatic fever. I mentioned before, when I got up from rheumatic fever.
The sense of your mortality.
And said, life is not a given. Whatever you're going to do, you better get up this morning and do it. And my father's, ringing in my ears with his words of, you got to get up early, stay late, work hard and smart in between. He had a number of things like that he would say. He was fond of saying, for example, that, and not everybody agrees with this, but remember, he worked as a pipeline ditch digger, where you go out on the truck in the morning, you get off the truck. And the first time I worked in the pipe gang, which was age 15, I guess, I worked as a brush cutter before that. But he said to me, don't forget, when you get off in the truck in the morning, what are the two questions you ask, Danny? And I said, well, I don't know. He said, two questions you ask, who's the boss and what does he want? So the work ethic definitely came from my parents and the example that they set.
The pride in that work.
The driving dream, my polar star, my navigational star, when I take compass readings professionally, my driving dream about being a good, if not a great journalist, came from somewhere deep within me, as I say, as I saw my parents read the newspaper. But I will say that whatever, quote, success, unquote, I've had, I do attribute to the fact that I have tried to work hard and that I've always had my eye on the unreachable star of being a great reporter.
Nature has always been a big part of your life and not a well-known fact about you. Can you tell us how you got in contact with nature and how you stayed in touch with nature?
Well, I appreciate you noticing, and it is that, let's face it, for a good part of my life, I have lived in an intensely urban environment. Washington, D.C., New York City, London, Saigon for that matter. But I spent so much time in nature when I was young, not just the hunting and fishing with my father, but I mentioned to you we lived right on the edge of town, and beyond us was a great forest. And I spent, endless hours and sometimes full days and on into the evening in the woods, the forest around Buffalo Bayou, which was just beyond our house. And that combined with the tutorials on the animals, squirrels, rabbits, for hunting purposes, gave me a love of nature, and I've always felt most myself when I'm in nature to this day, that I live in a concrete jungle in the middle of New York City, and love it in some ways for its energy and all of that. But there's always a voice within me about nature. And those woods that I mentioned around Buffalo Bayou, they were filled at that time with animal life. The bayou itself was filled with fish and turtles. I remember we captured what we thought was a giant soft-shelled turtle once, and we spent the whole day trying to capture him. And we finally got him wrapped up in grapevines, and we brought him back to the house, which was no small chore, in triumph, and put him in a wash tub, a big wash tub it was. But when my father got home and saw him, he was appalled, and made Georgie Hoyt, who is my friend who lived across the street, he went with us to carry that soft-shelled turtle all the way back, maybe a mile and a half at dark, to put him back in the bayou. So incidents like that, and answer your question, that I always feel, frankly, most at home in nature. And I don't know that I could survive in New York City if we didn't have a place outside. We have a place in the Catskills on the Beaverkill River, small fishing cottage there. The Beaverkill is a great trout fishing river. But we're in the middle of a vast woodland. There's a 55,000-acre state park practically abutting back up to our property. And that's where I really feel at home. Or if we're fishing here, some Bass Lake or along the Colorado, as you and I did, or on the coast, there's something about nature, and I don't want to be sacrilegious here, but when I'm in nature, I do feel I'm about as close to God as I'm going to get. And I consider the great forest, God's cathedral. To me, it's like being in church. I know some people who chuckle at that, and other people will frown and say, well, it's not enough. And I do go to church, not as often as I should, established churches. But I do see the great woods and forests and places around rivers and lakes as a cathedral.
This Pope Francis, actually said that a lot of people derive their connection with God through nature. And I appreciated that so much, because as a Texan and a descendant of Southern Baptists, I've been guilty all my life for not going to church, and he made it okay. Look, I could
That's
talk to
something
you.
else you and I shared, JT, that I was raised at Baptist Church at the West 14th Avenue Baptist Church in the Heights Annex. It's still there. It's under a different name now. They've changed names. I think it's called the Sunshine Baptist Church or something now. But it was hymn singing, foot washing, and total immersion.
I could literally talk to you for days and days, but I know your time is extremely limited. A couple more things if I could, because
Sure.
I know you got to run. You mentioned how much we've lost as a society. Could you put that in a nutshell for us?
Well, I'm not sure I can put it in a nutshell. For one thing, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a historian, working reporter, but I do think that among the things that have gone out of our society is a feeling for the land and a feeling for nature, that we are still, in many ways, in our minds, a frontier people. And the frontier people were very closely allied and felt a kinship with the earth. I can remember one of my earliest memories was my grandmother Page, who lived down in Bloomington, Texas. At a very early age, we were out one evening, and she said, Danny, run your hands through the dirt. It's big black loam soil down there. Run your hands through the dirt. And we literally ran my hands through the dirt. And she said, and then look at the stars, and which I did. And she said, never forget that you're part of and you're tied to the earth, and your destiny is in the stars. And this was a woman who had, at best, a fourth grade education. Mm. But back to your point of what we've lost, I think we have lost that sense of having our hands in the dirt, if you will, and our eyes on the stars. That the pace of life, the acceleration of the pace of life, has encouraged us, but not forced us, to forget who we are, what we are. So that's one thing that's gone out of life. I do think that another thing that has gone out of American life over my lifetime, many things are much for the better. And as you and I think, we talk when I was along the river, that I'm an optimist by nature and by experience. But you asked me the things that have gone out of our life. I think a sense of true patriotism in some ways has gone out because, and that may surprise some people, but I want to say because, partly with the encouragement sometimes of powerful people for their own partisan, political, and ideological purposes, have tried to get us to think in terms of nationalism as opposed to patriotism. And there's a difference between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism has at its red-beating heart humility. Patriotism is saying, I love my country, literally to the point I'd give my life for my country. But I recognize that it's not perfect, that we're constantly striving to make it better and better. There's that humility at the very center of patriotism. Nationalism, on the other hand, has at its center, its core, a kind of conceit, a kind of arrogance. It says, we're the best in the world. We always have been. We are now. We will be ongoing. Maybe a few things wrong in the country, but basically nothing wrong. So there's a great difference between patriotism and nationalism. And I do think that particularly over the last 35 or 40 years of my life, there's been a tendency to confuse the two. And I worry about that some.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And finally, I wish so much that you could speak directly to my young boys, 3 and 6, as adults. And hopefully that'll be a possibility. You're strong. And I think hopefully we can all get in the same boat and go fishing someday. But if you could give me a message of optimism that I could carry with me, because honestly, sir, that's the thing I lack right now. And I know you've seen turbulent times as great as this, and in terms of civil uprising, even greater. It seems like we're complacent in this sort of decay at this point. But can you give me a piece of optimism from your heart to deliver to my sons when they're of age to understand that message?
I'll try. But first I want to address you.
Okay. This
is not unusual, particularly these days, for people to say to me here in 2018, Dan Rather, I'm scared. I'm frightened for my country, the direction it's going. I'm frightened about what's happening in the world, and I'm frightened about myself and my family. It's a scary time. What I'd say to you, we'll talk in a moment about your children who are still of a very young age, is one, steady, just steady. That we have a lot of flaws and faults, we Americans. But throughout our history, by and large, we've been a very steady people and a society made up of steady individuals. So just steady. Secondly, know and appreciate your history, our history as a country, and for that matter, the history of the world. That in the great arc of history, things get better. They don't always get better at any given particular time. But if you look at the arc, things get better, things improve. And be optimistic. because the alternative is just digging yourself deeper and deeper in depression. But by being optimistic, we're talking about a realistic optimism. It's the kind of optimism to say things can get better and will get better if I strive to make a difference and the people around me strive to make a difference. It isn't going to be better, future isn't going to be better for my children unless I take some responsibility in making it better. Mine is not some fuzzy-headed optimism, just saying, well, everything's going to be all right, and just rock along. No. So that's for you. For the children, the first thing is love. It's always love. I spoke of being enveloped in love in my own family, and just love them. And the second thing is, with that love, never let this flame of idealism die out. They're young now. They probably don't even recognize what idealism is. But there is a small flame. And as they get older, it's very important that flame grow a little bit. And never let them lose their idealism. That'd be about as close as I could come. I do want to say that I'm worried about the country now. And I do understand when people tell me that they're afraid, they're scared. These are perilous times. And it's a dangerous time for our country. I do think it's a rather pivotal time. We've had them before. We had a great civil war in which we lost maybe 700,000 brother against brother fighting. We've had, great world wars. The 1960s were very divisive. We've had periods before. But if we just stay steady and say, I'm going to work to make things better, and keep that flame of idealism going, then we can be, and I think we will be all right. But in terms of your children, the number one thing is love. They have to know that you love them. And then beyond that, try to instill in them idealism, try to nurture that small flame along until the time may come, if you're really lucky and God smiles and you work hard on them, that they will burn with a hot, hard flame of idealism.
Dan, thank you so much for that message of wisdom, and I will carry that to my
Well, trust me, there's no wisdom in it, JT. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you peace and joy and love, and wish you good luck and Godspeed.
Thank you very much, sir. I look forward to maybe seeing you up in the Catskills. Me, you, and Joan Wolfe can wet a line together up there.
Thanks, JT.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye. Thanks again for listening to Drifting, presented by YETI and hosted by me, JT Van Zandt. To listen to more episodes, visit YETI.com or search Drifting on iTunes.